It was a cold January day when Washington, D.C. was filled with people from all over the country. The inauguration of a new president has always been a crowd-pleasing event, and this day was no exception. The atmosphere was tense but festive at the same time. People stood with flags, took selfies, discussed the future of the country, and children ran around, enjoying the energy that permeated the air. Amidst all the chaos, no one noticed a little girl in a wheelchair who had come with her family to watch the historic event. The girl looked a little tired, but her eyes shone with joy. She was holding a small notebook and a pen, constantly writing something down. This day had a special meaning for her. She had always dreamed of seeing the big world beyond her small town, and this was her chance to be part of something bigger. Her family stood nearby, keeping a close eye on her, but giving her space to enjoy the moment. The girl sat near the main entrance, where she could clearly see the stage and the huge screens. Her seat did not attract much attention, but from time to time passers-by would glance at her, quickly looking away. She was used to it. Her disability had always been a cause for curious or sympathetic looks, but she learned to ignore it, focusing on what really mattered to her. Among the crowd were children her age. They were playing, running, laughing, stopping near her from time to time. At first, their looks were just curious, but then they started to make fun of her. Some of them came closer, making an unpleasant gesture. They began to mock her wheelchair, her appearance. Their voices grew louder and louder, and their words were aimed at hurting her. The girl sat quietly, trying not to show how hard it was for her. She clutched her notebook to her chest, as if it were the only protection from this world. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to hold on. She didn't cry, although inside she could feel the tears starting to form. Her parents didn't notice, lost in the crowd. Other people who were nearby heard what was happening but did not intervene. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others just stood and watched, not daring to do anything. It was a moment that seemed endless for the girl. She felt completely alone, despite being among thousands of people. It was then that Keanu Reeves noticed her. He was in the crowd, enjoying the event, remaining almost invisible among ordinary people. His attention was drawn to a small group of children who were discussing something lively, directing their gazes at the girl. At first he just watched, trying to understand what was going on. But when he heard their mocking words and saw the girl trying to hide in her wheelchair, he could not remain indifferent. Keanu began to move slowly toward the girl. His steps were cautious but determined. He wanted to approach her without attracting too much attention, so as not to increase her suffering. He could see that her eyes were filled with sadness, but at the same time there was a hidden light in them. She was not giving up despite the situation. As Keanu got closer, he saw even more details. Her wheelchair was well maintained, but old, with scratches that spoke of years of use. Her clothes were neat but simple, and her shoes showed signs of wear and tear. She looked like a child who had been through a lot, but continued to fight for every moment of joy. The children who had been mocking her began to notice that someone was approaching. Their voices quieted down a bit, but they didn't stop completely. Keanu saw them looking at each other, a little confused. He stopped next to the girl, remaining calm and not saying a word. His presence alone sent a signal that this behavior was unacceptable. People around began to pay attention to what was happening. Some recognized Keanu, but most did not dare to come closer. The crowd began to disperse, and the children who had been mocking the girl quickly moved away, realizing that they were no longer the center of attention. Keanu stayed close to the girl, making sure she felt safe. He didn't leave until the situation calmed down completely. People standing nearby began to quietly discuss what had happened. Some expressed admiration for Keanu's intervention. Others finally expressed regret that they hadn't done anything themselves. But for the girl, this moment was about something more than just protection. She realized that even in the most difficult moments, there are people who are ready to stand by her side and support her. When things finally calmed down, Keanu gently leaned over to the girl, trying to see if she was okay. Her eyes were no longer full of fear, but there was a mixture of gratitude and surprise. This was just the beginning of a story that was to change not only that day, but the lives of many people who witnessed it. After the children who had been mocking the girl left, the atmosphere around her gradually began to calm down. But Keanu Reeves was in no hurry to leave. He stayed close to the girl, who continued to hold her notebook tightly in her hands. Her breathing was still a little labored, but she had already begun to calm down. Her eyes were still alert, as if she was waiting for someone to start insulting her again. Keanu, remaining calm, carefully examined the area around him. The crowd, which had previously consisted of indifferent or curious stares, began to disperse. People who had witnessed the scene exchanged quiet comments, but none of them approached. There was something symbolic about this moment, a quiet defense that did not require loud words or explanations. The girl looked up at Keanu. Her eyes were a mixture of surprise and gratitude. She was not used to anyone intervening on her behalf. Her experience had taught her that the world was often indifferent and sometimes cruel. But this man, who looked so calm and confident, broke that pattern. She felt that for the first time in a long time, someone actually cared. Keanu gestured for her to move a little further away from the crowd. She nodded, and he gently began pushing her wheelchair in the direction of a less crowded place where they could find some peace. They stopped at a small corner of the park where trees provided shade and protection from the noise of the crowd. The place was cozy, overlooking a small fountain. He sat down on a bench next to her, remaining silent so as not to put pressure on the girl. For several minutes they just sat in silence. It was not an oppressive silence, but a calm one that gave the girl time to collect her thoughts. She carefully put her notebook on her lap and took a deep breath. After a few minutes of calm, the girl was finally able to relax a little. Her shoulders, which had been tense before, dropped. She began to look at the fountain, watching the water dance under the sun's rays. This sight seemed to calm her down a bit. She began to replay the events of the last few minutes in her mind, trying to understand why this man had decided to help her. Keanu continued to sit next to her, taking his time to start a conversation. His experience told him that sometimes the best help is simply to be there without imposing your presence. He knew that the girl needed time to feel safe. After a while, she seemed to have gained some courage and moved her notebook a little to open a page. There were words written on it that looked like notes or snippets of text. Her handwriting was neat, but you could see that some of the letters were written with trembling, probably due to stress or excitement. Keanu noticed it, but didn't pay attention so as not to make her uncomfortable. Suddenly, a small group of people approached the fountain. They were dressed in formal clothes and seemed to be looking for someone. One of them, seeing the girl, stopped and quickly approached. It was her father. His face expressed both relief and anxiety. He thanked Keanu with a glance, but focused on his daughter, making sure she was okay. The girl was a little confused when she saw her father, but then she smiled. Her face brightened, and she showed him her notebook. He leaned over to see what she had written, and his face was full of pride. It turned out that the girl was recording her impressions of the day, describing everything that was happening around her. Keanu got up from the bench, realizing that his work here was done. But before he left, he leaned over to the girl and made sure she was okay again. Her father shook his hand warmly, thanking him for his intervention. It was a quiet but meaningful moment that showed that even a small action can have a huge impact. Returning to the crowd, Keanu felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was glad that he was able to help, but on the other hand, he realized that there are many stories like this girl's. He knew that this day would be just one of many moments when he could use his status and influence to make a difference. And although this episode ended, for Keanu, it was just the beginning of another story that mattered. As Keanu Reeves walked away from the girl and her family, he was still absorbed in the events of the last hour. His thoughts circled around the girl, her strength, and how unfair this day had been for her. He knew he had to do more than just intervene in the moment. And as the events of the inauguration continued, his thoughts were focused on this one story. The little girl, now being pushed gently in her wheelchair by her father back to where their family was gathered, began to attract the attention of other people. People who had previously been busy with their phones or discussing the events were now casting glances in her direction. Some recognized Keanu, who had just left, and began whispering, trying to understand what had happened. The girl's father stopped near a small group of volunteers who were handing out water and drinks. He asked for a few bottles, and the girl continued to hold her notebook in her lap. Her gaze was directed somewhere in the distance, but inside, she seemed to be reviewing the events of the day. The notebook had become a way for her to cope with her emotions, and she was used to writing down her thoughts when the world seemed too loud or cruel. While the girl and her family tried to find some peace, Keanu stopped by a makeshift media center located nearby. There were journalists, bloggers, and volunteers covering the day's events. One of the reporters saw him and immediately ran over, hoping to get a comment. But Keanu politely declined and continued on his way. He didn't want the story to become a sensation. His goal was to give the girl and her family a chance for dignity and respect. However, even after that, he could not go any further. The feeling that the girl's story needed more closure led him to contact one of the organizers of the event. It turned out that this person had access to the stage and could influence the events taking place in public. Keanu decided to use this opportunity to make the girl's voice heard. After half an hour, a short break was announced in the main program. People were walking around the square discussing what was happening and enjoying the music playing in the background. Suddenly, a voice on the microphone asked for attention. The organizers decided to give the floor to Keanu, who was not only a guest, but now a symbol of humanity for many. Keanu went up on stage holding a piece of paper on which he had made some notes. His speech was short but powerful. He spoke about something he had just witnessed, about a little girl who, despite all the difficulties, continued to fight for the right to be equal among others. He did not mention her name, but described her strength, courage, and faith in the best. The crowd, which had remained relatively noisy up to that point, gradually quieted down. People listened attentively, some even wiping away tears. Keanu urged everyone to be kinder to each other, mentioning that everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. After the speech was over, the girl and her family were unexpectedly invited on stage. Her father, who was hesitant at first, eventually agreed. People applauded when they came up. The girl looked a little embarrassed, but her eyes were shining. She was holding her notebook, and when the microphone was brought to her, she hesitantly took the floor. Her voice was quiet but confident. She spoke about how hard it was to live with a disability, how often she faced ridicule, and how this day was special to her. She thanked Keanu for standing up for her and everyone who supports her now. Her words were simple but real, and they touched the hearts of everyone in the crowd. As the event came to an end, many people approached the girl and her family to express their support. Some offered help. Others simply said how much they were inspired by the story. The journalists who were present began to spread the story, but with an emphasis on humanity and strength of spirit. Keanu, leaving the square late in the afternoon, saw the girl smiling and her parents looking calmer than they had at the beginning of the day. He knew that this day was not only a challenge for them, but also a source of new hope. For him, it was another opportunity to remind himself why it is so important to remain kind in a world that is often cruel. And although he would return to his normal life the next morning, he was sure that this girl's story would live on, inspiring others to do good deeds. After the girl and her family left the stage, the atmosphere in the square remained charged with emotion. People discussed Keanu Reeves' words, his speech, and the incredible story of the little girl. The day that began with disappointment and injustice has now turned into a symbol of hope, humanity, and strength. When the event officially ended, Keanu decided that he wanted to do more for the girl and others like her. He realized that the event on stage was important, but a speech alone is not enough to change the lives of people who face similar challenges every day. His mission was to find a lasting solution. After talking to several of the event organizers, Keanu learned more about the girl's family. Her name was Emma, and she came from a small town in the Midwest. Her parents were ordinary workers who did their best to provide for her medical care and education. However, their resources were extremely limited. Keanu decided that he could use his connections and influence to help them. He contacted several charities that worked with children with disabilities. He wanted to create a platform that would not only support Emma, but also help other children who face similar challenges. The organizations were excited by his idea and ready to work together. Keanu decided to meet Emma's family in person to discuss how he could help. They agreed to meet at a small cafe near the hotel where Emma's parents were staying. It was a modest but warm meeting. Emma's parents looked a little anxious, but also grateful. Emma was as calm as she was on stage, but her eyes were shining. She was holding her notebook, which has now become a symbol of strength and inspiration for her. Keanu, seeing her, immediately realized that this girl has a great willpower. She began to share her dreams, how she wanted to become a writer and write stories that would inspire others. Her words impressed Keanu. He felt that Emma had potential that was just waiting to be nurtured. Her dreams reminded him of how important it is to have someone who believes in you, even when things seem impossible. After the meeting, Keanu returned to his temporary office in the hotel.